The wind in that part of Wyoming was a living thing. It had a voice, a low and constant moan that scraped across the plains and clawed at the walls of Eli Morgan's cabin like a hungry animal. It was a sculptor, too, carving the land into long, lonely buttes and wearing the mountains down to their bones. It had worked on Eli the same way, scouring away any softness until all that remained was quiet strength and a deep-seated solitude. At 32, his face was already a map of hard miles and squinting suns, the lines around his eyes etched deeper than his years. He lived alone, and he preferred it that way. The company of the wind was enough. He rode his dun gelding, Dust, along the northern fence line, his movements economical and sure. The air was thick and tasted of grit. A storm was brewing, not of rain, but of earth. The horizon was a bruised, yellowish-brown curtain being drawn across the sky. He checked the tension of the wire, his gloved hands moving with the familiar grace of a man who had done the same task 1,000 times. Each post, each length of wire, was a barrier he had built between his world and the one beyond. It kept his cattle in, but it also kept everything else out. People, mostly. People brought trouble, noise, and expectations. People brought pain. A spire of rock, twisted and sharp against the darkening sky, caught his eye. He saw it every day, but some days it pulled at him harder than others. It was near that rock that his world had split in two. He was 19 then, and his brother, Jacob, was 17. Jacob, with his easy grin and a laugh that could startle a flock of grouse from a thicket. They'd been riding that same ridge, tracking a stray heifer. The argument had been simmering for weeks, a low boil of greed and pride between their father and the cattle baron from the next county over, a man named Henderson who believed any land his herd touched was his own. Eli had felt the danger in the air, a tension tighter than a new rope. He had told Jacob to stay back, to let him ride ahead. "I can handle myself, Eli," Jacob had said, his chin jutted out with the foolish pride of a boy trying to prove he was a man. "We're Morgans. We don't run." The memory came not in a clean line, but in flashes of heat and sound. The sudden appearance of Henderson's men, their faces hard and shadowed beneath the brims of their hats. The glint of sun on a rifle barrel. A shout. He remembered the sickening jolt as a bullet tore through his own thigh. The fire that spread through his leg as he fell from his saddle. He remembered the crack of Jacob's rifle, defiant and young. Then another sound, a wet, final thud. Through the haze of his own pain, Eli had seen him, sprawled in the sagebrush, the life fading from his eyes before he'd even finished falling. Eli had tried to get to him, crawling, dragging his useless leg, his throat raw from screaming a name that got lost in the vast, indifferent sky. He had failed. He was the older brother. His one job in this world had been to protect Jacob, and he had lain in the dirt while his brother died. The guilt was a stone he carried in his gut, a cold, heavy thing that had settled there and never left. He hadn't been able to protect his own blood, so he kept away from others now, kept his world small and manageable. A man can't fail people he doesn't have. The wind bit harder, pulling him from the memory. The dust storm was no longer on the horizon. It was on top of him. The world dissolved into a blinding, choking torrent of sand. Day turned to a suffocating twilight. Eli dismounted, pulling his neckerchief up over his nose and mouth, his hand resting on Dust's neck to soothe the nervous animal. He would have to lead him home, trusting his own sense of direction more than his eyes. The cabin was less than a mile south. They would make it. He took a step, then another, his boots sinking into the shifting ground. It was the lack of sound that made him stop. The wind howled, a deafening roar, but through it, or under it, there had been another sound, a stumble, a weak, human cough. He held perfectly still, listening. Nothing but the wind. He must have imagined it. He took another step. There it was again. A shape, a flicker of movement in the brown chaos. No more than 20 yards away. It was small, hunched over, staggering like a newborn calf. A coyote, maybe, or a lost pronghorn, but it was moving on 2 legs. He drew the Colt from his hip, its weight a familiar comfort in his palm. He didn't raise it, just kept it low at his side. He moved forward slowly, one careful step at a time. The shape grew clearer. A person, a woman. She was a wreck of a thing. Her dress, once perhaps a modest calico, was torn at the shoulder and hemmed with dirt and something dark that looked like dried blood. Her hair had come loose from whatever pins had held it and whipped around her face in a wild, tangled mess. She had no hat, and she had no shoes. He could see her bare feet, pale against the dark earth, bruised and cut. She took a few more halting steps toward the dry creek bed. Then her legs gave out and she collapsed to her knees, her head bowed as if in prayer or utter defeat. Eli holstered his pistol and closed the distance. He made his steps heavy so she would hear him coming, so he would not startle her. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. Her face was smudged with dirt and tear tracks. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have burned everything else away. They were the eyes of a rabbit caught in a snare. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from the dust and disuse. She flinched, scrambling backward, pushing herself away with her hands. "No," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "No, please." He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you. You need shelter. There's a storm." "Stay away," she croaked, her eyes darting past him, as if looking for pursuers in the blinding dust. "There's nobody else out here," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Just me. My cabin is close." Panic flared brighter in her eyes. "No, I cannot go to town. I will not." "My place ain't in town," he said. "It's north of here. Just a line cabin." She shook her head, a violent, desperate motion. "Please," she begged, and the word was a raw wound. "Do not take me to the preacher's house. I will not go back there. I will die first." The preacher's house. The words hung in the swirling dust between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Eli looked at her torn dress, the blood, the raw terror on her face. 100 ugly stories bloomed and died in his mind. He didn't want to know any of them. He wanted to turn around, mount his horse, and ride back into his quiet, orderly life. He wanted to leave her to the storm. But then he saw her bare feet, the small, dark cuts on the soles and toes. And he saw the ghost of a 17-year-old boy lying in the sagebrush. He had failed to save one person. He would not fail another. Not today. "All right," he said, his voice flat with resignation. "No town, no preacher's house." He extended a hand. "You can come with me, or you can stay out here and let the storm bury you. Your choice." She stared at his hand for a long moment, her chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. He saw the war in her eyes, the instinct to run versus the simple, animal need for survival. Finally, survival won. She gave a small, defeated nod. She didn't take his hand, but she used the creek bank to pull herself, swaying, to her feet. He saw then that she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe not even 20. He walked to his horse, took the canteen from the saddle, and handed it to her. She drank greedily, spilling water down her chin and onto the front of her ruined dress. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with the back of a bruised hand and gave the canteen back, her eyes never quite meeting his. "Can you ride?" he asked. She shook her head. He sighed. It was a long way to walk in this gale. He cupped his hands. "Put your foot here. I'll lift you up." He helped her onto Dust's back, her slight weight barely registering to the big horse. She sat stiffly in the saddle, her hands clutching the horn as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had come apart. Eli took the reins and began the slow walk home, leading the horse and its strange, broken cargo into the heart of the storm. The cabin was a single room, built of sturdy pine logs chinked with mud and stone. A fireplace dominated one wall, its stones blackened with soot. A narrow cot was pushed against the opposite wall. with a table and 2 chairs in the center. It was a space stripped down to necessities, clean and ordered. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. Eli led the woman inside and shut the heavy door, cutting off the shriek of the wind. The sudden silence was immense. He lit the lantern on the table, and the small room filled with a warm, yellow glow. In the steady light, he could see her more clearly. The cut on her forehead was shallow, but had bled freely. Dark, ugly bruises mottled the skin of her arms, shaped like gripping fingers. Her lip was split. She stood dripping on the floorboards, shivering, her arms wrapped around herself. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair by the hearth. He moved to the fireplace and began building a fire, his motions swift and practiced. He did not look at her, sensing that her fear was a wild thing that might bolt at a direct gaze. He gave her the space of his silence. The fire caught, and hungry flames began to lick at the dry kindling. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the fire. "There's a blanket on the cot," he said, his back still to her. "Get out of that wet dress. I'll make some coffee." He heard her move, the soft shuffle of her bare feet on the wood floor. He kept his attention on the fire, adding larger pieces of wood until it was a steady, crackling blaze. He measured coffee grounds into the pot, his mind a blank. He was a man running on instinct, the ingrained duty to offer shelter to those in need, even a need he did not understand and did not want to. When he finally turned around, she was huddled in the chair, wrapped in his thickest wool blanket. Her wet dress lay in a heap on the floor beside her. She had tried to clean her face with the corner of the blanket, but it only smeared the dirt. He poured hot water into a basin and set it on the table with a clean rag. "Here," he said gruffly. She looked at the basin, then at him, her eyes full of a deep, bottomless weariness. She nodded her thanks and began to clean her face and hands with slow, pained movements. As she leaned forward, the blanket shifted, in the hollow of her throat, just above the line of the wool. He saw another dark bruise, ugly and stark against her pale skin. And then he saw something else, tucked into the folds of her corset, which she still wore, was the handle of a small knife. It was a slender, mean-looking thing, more of a letter opener than a skinning knife, but it was a weapon all the same. She saw him looking, and her hand flew to her chest, pulling the blanket tight, her eyes flashing with a spark of defiance. He looked away, pretending he hadn't seen it. He poured 2 cups of coffee, added a spoonful of sugar to hers, and set one on the table beside her. He took his own and leaned against the far wall, sipping the hot, black liquid. They sat that way in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the storm outside. She drank her coffee, her hands trembling so badly she had to hold the cup with both of them. She did not offer her name, and he did not ask for it. She was a piece of trouble that had washed up on his doorstep, and, for now, that was all he needed to know. When she finished, she set the cup down. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli just nodded. He took a spare bedroll from a chest at the foot of his cot and laid it out for her on the floor near the hearth, as far from his own bed as the small room would allow. "You can sleep there. It'll be warm." She looked at the bedroll, then at his cot, and a fresh wave of apprehension crossed her face. "You have nothing to fear from me, ma'am," he said, his voice low and firm. It was the truest thing he could offer her. She seemed to believe him. Her shoulders slumped in relief, and she pulled the blanket tighter as she settled onto the bedroll, curling into a tight ball with her back to him. Within minutes, the exhaustion of her ordeal claimed her, and her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Eli stayed by the wall, finishing his coffee. He looked at the small, huddled shape by his fire. He had invited a storm into his house to escape the one outside. He didn't know her name, where she was from, or what she was running from. He only knew that she was hurt, terrified, and armed. He banked the fire, blew out the lantern, and lay down on his cot. His hand resting on the butt of the Colt he kept under his pillow. He lay awake for hours, listening to the wind and the troubled breathing of the stranger in his home, feeling the cold weight of the stone in his gut. The scream tore him from a shallow sleep. It was not a yell for help, but a raw, animal cry of pure terror, sharp and ragged. Eli was on his feet before he was fully awake, his gun in his hand, his heart pounding against his ribs. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. In the dim light, he saw her. She was sitting bolt upright on the bedroll, her hands thrown out in front of her as if to ward off a blow. Her eyes were wide and unseeing, fixed on a nightmare that was still playing out behind them. She was breathing in harsh, panicked gasps. He took a step toward her, then stopped. The look on her face was not for him. It was for a phantom in the room, a memory with teeth. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of green soldiers after their first battle, in the eyes of a man who had watched his homestead burn. To intrude on that kind of pain was a violation. He stood there, a silent sentinel in the dark, and waited. Slowly, she came back to herself. Her gasping breaths quieted into shuddering sobs. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and rocked back and forth, a low, mournful sound catching in her throat. Eli quietly holstered his pistol. He could offer her no comfort for a hurt he didn't understand, so he did the only thing he could. He returned to his cot, lay down, and pretended to be asleep. He did not want her to feel the shame of being watched in her moment of utter vulnerability. He lay there, listening to her quiet weeping, until the sound was finally swallowed by the relentless moan of the wind. The storm did not break. For 3 days, the world outside the cabin was a howling chaos of wind and driving rain that turned the dust to a thick, clinging mud. They were trapped, 2 strangers in a box of logs, surrounded by the fury of the elements. A tense and fragile routine formed in the silence. Eli would rise before dawn, tend the fire, and go out to the small barn to feed Dust and the 2 milk cows he kept. He would return, soaked to the bone, and spend the day mending tack, sharpening tools, or just sitting and watching the rain lash against the single window pane. She kept to herself. She stayed by the fire, wrapped in the blanket, speaking only when necessary. "The water bucket is low. May I have another piece of bread?" Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. He learned the rhythms of her fear. She startled at any sudden noise. She never turned her back on him completely. She ate the food he gave her, salt pork, beans, hard biscuits, without complaint but without appetite, as if eating were a chore she had to perform to stay alive. But in the forced confinement, things began to shift. The silence, at first a barrier, became a space they shared. He started to notice small things about her, the way her long, dark hair, now clean and brushed with a comb he'd left on the table for her, caught the firelight, the intelligence in her cautious eyes when she watched him work, her gaze lingering on the skillful movement of his hands. One afternoon, he was cleaning his rifle, the familiar weight and smell of the oil and steel a calming ritual. He felt her eyes on him. He glanced up and met her gaze. She didn't look away immediately this time. "You know how to use that?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I do," he answered. "Have you ever had to?" He thought of Jacob. He thought of the range war and the bodies left in the dirt. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. He offered no more. A shadow passed over her face, a look of understanding, and she fell silent again. Another day, she found an old book of his, its cover worn and spine cracked. It was poetry, something his mother had cherished. She sat with it for hours, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips sometimes moving silently as she read. Seeing her lost in those pages, he felt a strange and unwelcome stirring in his chest, a flicker of warmth in a place that had been cold for a very long time. The tension was no longer just fear and suspicion. It was changing, deepening into an unspoken awareness. He would catch the scent of her, a clean, rain-washed scent that cut through the cabin's masculine smells of leather and smoke. She would watch him as he moved about the room, his broad shoulders filling the small space. Once, reaching for the kettle at the same time, their hands brushed. A jolt, hot and sharp as a lightning strike, passed between them. They both pulled back as if burned, a flush rising on her cheeks, a muscle tightening in his jaw. On the morning of the fourth day, the wind finally died. The rain softened to a drizzle, and a pale, watery light filtered through the window. The world outside was washed clean, glistening and new. The air in the cabin, however, remained thick with everything unsaid. The storm that had trapped them was over, but a different kind of storm was just beginning to gather within those four walls. With the passing of the storm, a quiet truce settled over the cabin. The world outside was an endless expanse of clean-washed sky and damp earth. But inside, the air was still charged with the things they did not say. He could not just let her sit by the fire forever. A body needed purpose, same as a horse needed a run. On the second morning after the rain stopped, he found her staring out the window, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "I need to mend the fence line down by the south pasture," he said, not looking at her directly but speaking to the room. "Wire snapped in the wind. I could use a hand carrying the tools." It was not a question, but it was not quite an order, either. It was an offering, a way for her to be something other than a frightened guest. She turned from the window, her expression unreadable. After a long moment, she gave a single, curt nod. He found a pair of his old work pants and a shirt for her, both far too large. But they would protect her from the brush. He'd spent the previous evening working a piece of soft leather, painstakingly crafting a pair of simple moccasins for her feet. He left them by her bedroll without a word. When she emerged from behind the blanket, he'd hung for privacy. She had rolled the sleeves of the shirt and the legs of the pants, and the moccasins were on her feet. She looked small and lost in his clothes, but she stood a little taller. That day set the pattern for the ones that followed. Their lives became a shared rhythm of work, a silent partnership dictated by the needs of the ranch. He taught her how to groom a horse, the long, firm strokes of the brush, the gentle way to pick stones from a hoof. She was hesitant at first, her movements timid, but she listened intently, her eyes following his hands, and she learned quickly. She had a quiet way with the animals, a patience that seemed to calm them. In return, she took over the cooking. The first meals were simple variations of his own meager fare, but soon she began to transform the salt pork and beans. She found a small patch of wild onions behind the cabin and worked them into a stew. She baked biscuits that were surprisingly light and fluffy. They would eat at the small table, the silence between them no longer heavy with suspicion, but filled with the companionable sounds of clinking forks and the crackle of the fire. In these small, domestic acts, a fragile intimacy began to grow. He would come in from the cold, and a cup of hot coffee would be waiting for him. He would leave a pail of milk on the table, and later would find a pat of fresh butter cooling in a dish. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she spoke without being spoken to, her voice low. "I was to be married," she said, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Almost." Eli didn't move. He kept his eyes on the piece of wood he was whittling, letting the silence draw the rest of the story out of her. "My father arranged it," she continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He was a good man, but practical. He said it was a good match. The man was from a respected family." She paused, and her hands twisted in the lap of her borrowed pants. "I fled. Before the wedding." She offered nothing more. The words she left unsaid were louder than the ones she had spoken. Abuse, coercion, fear. He heard it all in that single, stark admission. He did not press her for details. A man who carried his own ghosts knew better than to stir up someone else's. He simply nodded, a small, accepting motion. Her secret, or the small piece of it she had offered, was safe with him. He had taken her in to save her from the storm, but now he felt a different instinct taking root, the need to save her from whatever man had put that look in her eyes. A week after she arrived, supplies ran low. He needed flour, salt, and cartridges. He needed to go to town. He hated the thought of leaving her alone, but he also dreaded the thought of taking her with him. The town of Redemption was a small, hard place, where whispers traveled faster than a prairie fire. A strange woman would be noticed. "I have to ride into Redemption," he told her that morning. "I'll be gone the whole day. Bolt the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." He handed her the spare Colt he kept in his saddlebag. "You know how to use this?" She took the heavy pistol, her hand surprisingly steady. "My father taught me." He nodded. "Good. Use it if you have to." The ride to town was tense. The open sky, which usually brought him a sense of peace, felt full of watching eyes. Redemption was little more than a dusty main street flanked by a dozen false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a smithy, and a church whose steeple seemed to stab at the sky. He tied dust to the hitching rail in front of Miller's general store and went inside, the bell over the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that was at odds with his mood. The store smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and pickle brine. Mr. Miller, a bald man with a perpetually worried expression, was measuring out sugar for one of the church ladies. As Eli gathered his supplies, he kept his ears open. It did not take long. "A terrible business," the woman, Mrs. Gable, was saying, her voice a low, dramatic hiss. "Right there in the house of God's own servant. The preacher is beside himself with grief and rage." "Stabbed him, you say, Mr.?" Miller asked, his eyes wide. "With a vicious little dagger," Mrs. Gable confirmed, leaning closer. "The boy, Samuel, is lucky to be alive. He tried to minister to her sinful soul. You see, a fallen woman, run off from her own wedding, and she repaid his Christian charity with violence." Eli's blood ran cold. He kept his back to them, pretending to inspect a display of canned peaches. "They say she's a temptress," Mrs. Gable went on, warming to her subject. "Wild hair, and eyes that could lead a man straight to perdition. She fled into the wilderness, barefoot like some kind of savage. The sheriff put a deputy on it, but it's like she vanished from the earth." He paid for his things, his face a stony mask, and left without his usual pleasantries. The description was too close. Wild hair, fled a wedding, vanished into the wilderness. The name Clara, which she had finally whispered to him one night, echoed in his mind. He loaded his supplies, his movements stiff. The world he had built to keep trouble out was now a cage, holding the biggest trouble of his life. He was halfway home when he saw the rider. The man wore a deputy's star on his vest. Eli reined in his horse, his hand resting casually on his thigh, inches from his gun. The deputy, a young man with a thin mustache and overly eager eyes, pulled up beside him. "Morgan," he said with a nod. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy," Eli said, his voice level. "I'm sure," the deputy said, letting his gaze drift over Eli's pack horse, laden with supplies. "Stocking up heavy. Winter's coming." The deputy nodded, stroking his mustache. "Say, Eli, you're a man who keeps to himself. You don't get many visitors out your way, but you see a lot of country. You haven't seen a stray, have you? A woman, traveling alone, dark hair, might look a bit rough." Eli met the young man's gaze without blinking. The lie came easier than he thought it would. "Can't say that I have. The only females I've seen lately have 4 legs and a long tail." The deputy chuckled, but his eyes remained sharp, searching. "Well, if you do, you be careful. She's wanted. Stabbed Preacher Collins's boy. She's dangerous." "I'll keep that in mind," Eli said. He gave a slight nudge to his horse. "I've got cattle to see to." He rode away without looking back, the deputy's stare boring into his shoulder blades. The lie sat in his stomach, a hard, unfamiliar knot. He had lied to the law. He had chosen her, a woman he barely knew, over the rules he had always lived by. He found her exactly where he had left her. The cabin door bolted from the inside. When he knocked, she demanded to know who it was, her voice sharp with fear. The relief on her face when she saw him was so profound it was almost painful to see. That night, an uneasy quiet settled between them. He did not tell her about the whispers in town or his encounter with the deputy. What good would it do? It would only feed the fear that already consumed her. He tried to act as if nothing had changed, but something had. The world was shrinking around them. His ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a hiding place. Later, after their sparse meal, he went out to the small forge he had built near the barn. He had a cracked branding iron that needed fixing. And the physical work, the heat and the hammer and the sweat, was what he needed to pound out the tension in his own mind. He stripped off his shirt in the humid night air and set to work, heating the iron in the glowing coals. The rhythmic clang of his hammer on the anvil was the only sound in the vast darkness. He did not know she was watching. Clara stood in the deep shadow of the cabin's doorway, a silhouette against the faint lantern light from within. She watched the play of firelight on the taut muscles of his back and shoulders, the way they bunched and coiled with each swing of the hammer. She saw the old scars that crisscrossed his skin, pale lines that spoke of a life of violence and hardship. He was a man made of the same unforgiving elements as the land he lived on, hard, quiet, and enduring. A feeling she could not name, a deep and painful ache, rose in her chest. It was a hunger, but not for food. It was a longing for the safety his strength represented, for the quiet honor she saw in his every action. He had taken her in, fed her, clothed her, and asked for nothing in return. He had looked at her bruises and her hidden knife and had not recoiled. He had lied for her. In her world, men took what they wanted with pious words or with brute force. This man gave. The sight of him, so powerful and yet so gentle, was an agony. The desire to walk out into the night, to feel those strong arms around her, to be held and protected, was so overwhelming it made her dizzy. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob, and retreated back into the shadows of the cabin, her own repressed hunger a terrifying force. He worked late, until the iron was mended and his body ached with a satisfying weariness. When he finally came back inside, she was sitting at the table, waiting. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and her face was pale in the lamplight. "You're still awake," he said, his voice rough. She didn't answer right away. She just stared at him, her eyes searching his face. When she finally spoke, her voice was a trembling whisper. "The men in town," she said. "They're looking for me, aren't they?" He didn't insult her by denying it. He just nodded. Her composure crumbled. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "They say I am a wicked woman, a sinner. They say I tempted him." The words came out choked and bitter. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, her eyes full of a desperate, pleading question. "Do you think I'm still innocent, Cowboy?" The question hung in the air between them, fragile and heavy. It was a plea for a verdict, for his judgment. He was the only person in her world who had not condemned her. He looked at her, at the terror and the shame and the fierce, defiant spark that still burned deep in her eyes. He thought of the bruises on her arms and the knife she kept hidden. He thought of her nightmares. Innocence was a word for children and fools, a luxury this world rarely afforded. It had no place out here. He walked over to the water bucket, ladled some into a cup, and drank it down. He took his time, choosing his words as carefully as he would choose his footing on a treacherous slope. Finally, he turned back to her. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and devoid of judgment. "You're still standing," he said simply. "That's what matters." Her breath hitched. She stared at him, her lips parted. as if she had expected a sermon or a condemnation, and his simple, pragmatic words had disarmed her completely. He wasn't judging her past. He was acknowledging her present. He was honoring her survival. For the second time since she had arrived, she began to cry. But this time it was not the ragged sobbing of a nightmare. It was a quiet, broken weeping of a soul that had been granted a small, unexpected measure of grace. That night, her dreams were a maelstrom of memory. She was back in the preacher's house, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and hypocrisy. She saw the face of Samuel, the preacher's son, his eyes alight with a righteous fire that masked a colder, more predatory hunger. He had courted her with scriptures, his hands brushing hers over a shared hymn book, his promises of a godly marriage, a gilded cage she had been too afraid to see. The dream shifted to their betrothal night, in the parlor, under the stern. Painted eyes of his ancestors. He had spoken of her duty as a wife, of her submission. His hands had not been gentle. They had been hard and demanding, bruising her arms as he pushed her back against the horsehair sofa. She felt the scratch of the wool, the sickening pressure of his body, the foul whisper in her ear about cleansing her of her womanly pride. The knife had been on the table, a fruit knife next to a bowl of apples. Her hand had closed around the handle, a desperate, instinctual act of self-preservation. The dream ended with the shock on his face, the dark bloom of red on his pristine white shirt, and the sound of her own ragged screams echoing in the pious, suffocating silence of that house. She remembered the preacher's wife casting her out, not with pity, but with a cold fury, her face twisted in disgust. "Seductress!" she had hissed. "Harlot!" She had run, barefoot and bleeding, into the unforgiving wilderness, the town's condemnation chasing her like a pack of hounds. She woke with a strangled sob, the phantom pain of his hands still on her skin. The cabin was dark and silent, save for the steady breathing of the man on the other side of the room. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, for the girl she had been and the woman she had been forced to become. Eli heard her. He had been lying awake, staring into the darkness, his mind replaying their conversation. He heard the muffled gasp that pulled her from sleep, and the quiet, heartbreaking sobs that followed. Every instinct told him to go to her, to offer, what? Comfort? Words were useless against that kind of pain. He knew, so he did the only other thing he could think of. He swung his legs off his cot, his feet making no sound on the floorboards. He picked up his rifle, walked to the cabin door, and sat on the floor with his back against it, facing into the room where she wept. He didn't say a word. He just sat there in the darkness, a silent guardian, listening, letting her know by his presence alone that she was not facing her ghosts by herself. The day after her confession of tears, the world felt different. The air in the cabin was clearer, as if a fever had broken. Eli looked at her not as a fragile victim, but as a survivor. And survival, he knew, required more than just a roof and a meal. It required teeth. He started that morning, after their silent breakfast. He took her out into the bright, cold air. He set up an empty tin can on a fence post 50 feet away. He pressed his own Colt into her hand, closing her fingers around the worn wooden grip. "The fear is the first thing that will kill you," he said, his voice low and even, standing just behind her shoulder. "You have to breathe it out. Let your hand get steady. Don't think about the man. Think about the can. It's just a can." The pistol was heavy in her hand, a solid, brutal weight. The first time she fired, the recoil slammed her arm back, and the shot went wild, kicking up dirt 10 feet to the left. The sound of it, a deafening crack that echoed off the mountains, made her flinch violently. "Again," was all he said. He did not touch her, but his presence was a steadying force beside her. He corrected her stance, showed her how to line up the sight, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. Day after day they practiced, until her arm no longer shook, until the roar of the gun was just a sound, until the tin can jumped from the post 3 times out of 5. He watched her determination, the way her jaw set and her eyes narrowed. She was not a natural shot, but she had a will of iron. He taught her to ride not like a lady, perched side saddle and helpless, but like him, astride the horse, her legs strong, her hands firm on the reins. He gave her an old, gentle mare, but he led her over rough country, teaching her to trust the animal, to feel the shift of its muscles beneath her, to become a part of its strength. He saw her confidence grow with each successful ride, a straightness returning to her spine that had not been there before. Her own skills, when they revealed themselves, were a surprise. One afternoon, he was mending a harness, struggling to cut a clean, straight line in a thick piece of leather with his skinning knife. She was watching from the barn door. "May I?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, then handed her the knife and the leather. She took it, and her entire demeanor changed. Her hands, which could be so hesitant, became swift and sure. She turned the small knife he'd seen her with over in her palm, its handle fitting there as if it were an extension of her own fingers. With a single, fluid motion, she drew the blade across the leather. The cut was perfect, deep and clean. She handed it back to him, her eyes downcast, as if ashamed of the skill she possessed. He looked from the perfectly cut strap to her face. That was no fruit knife. That was a weapon she knew how to use intimately. It was another piece of her story, another testament to the life that had forced her to become so sharp, so ready to defend herself. He said nothing, just took the leather and continued his work. But a new, deeper respect settled in him. She was not just learning to be strong. She had been strong all along, in her own desperate way. Their days were a rhythm of shared tasks, their evenings a quiet space carved out by the fire. The unspoken attraction between them was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their lives. It was in the way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin, the way she would glance up from her mending when he entered the room. It was a dangerous, tender thing, growing in the silence. The moment it broke the surface came unexpectedly, born of a simple accident. A new calf had taken sick, its breathing shallow and ragged. They worked together in the barn, Eli forcing a mixture of herbs and whiskey down the animal's throat, while Clara held its head steady. The calf, weak as it was, thrashed its head, and in the sudden movement, Clara's hand slipped. The sharp edge of a bucket latch sliced a deep gash across her palm. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and pulled her hand back, blood welling instantly, dark and red against her skin. "Let me see," Eli said, his voice rough with concern. He took her hand in his. His touch was calloused and firm, completely enveloping her smaller hand. At the contact, her entire body went rigid. She flinched, a violent, full-body tremor, her eyes wide with a familiar terror, as if she were bracing for a blow. He stopped, his grip loosening but not letting go. He simply held her hand, waiting, letting her feel the simple, steady warmth of his skin. A touch that asked for nothing. He saw the war in her eyes, the reflexive fear battling with a dawning realization. This touch was different. It did not seek to take, it sought to heal. Slowly, agonizingly, the tension drained out of her. The rigid line of her shoulders softened. Instead of pulling away, she leaned into his touch, just a fraction of an inch. A silent surrender. Her breath shuddered out of her. It was a monumental act of trust, a quiet miracle happening in the dusty, hay-scented air of the barn. He led her back to the cabin, his hand still gently holding hers. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, his movements careful and precise. She hissed at the sting but did not pull away. He wrapped her palm with a strip of clean cloth, his large, rough fingers surprisingly gentle as he tied the knot. When he was done, his hands lingered on hers for a beat longer than necessary. He could feel the fine, rapid pulse in her wrist. He looked up and met her gaze. Her eyes were dark and deep, full of a raw, aching vulnerability that stole the air from his lungs. He let her go and stepped back, the space between them suddenly crackling with a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. That evening, the silence was different. It was not comfortable. It was a taut wire stretched between them, humming with the memory of his touch. He poured them both a measure of whiskey, the liquor a welcome burn in his throat. Clara cradled her bandaged hand, staring into the flames. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible over the fire's crackle. "For my hand, for everything." He just nodded, taking a slow sip of his drink. She was quiet for a long time, and he thought the conversation was over. But then she spoke again, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it. "Eli," she said, using his name for the first time. It sounded strange and intimate in the small room. "Have you ever touched a woman who did not flinch?" The question was a stone dropped into the deep well of his own solitude. It was not an accusation, but a genuine, heartbreaking inquiry. She was asking if all women were like her, branded by fear, or if she was the only one. He thought of the women he had known before, the saloon girls who offered a practiced, hollow comfort for a price, the few respectable daughters of ranchers he had danced with at socials long ago, before Jacob's death had soured him on the world. He had no answer for her that was not a lie or a cruelty. He said nothing. He simply reached for the bottle and poured another finger of whiskey into her tin cup. He topped off his own. He slid her cup closer to her on the rough-hewn table. It was the only answer he had. "I am here. I am listening. I will not hurt you." They sat in silence, the fire popping and hissing, the whiskey burning a slow, steady path in the cold, empty places inside them both. The next time he rode to Redemption, the news was posted on the sheriff's office door, a crude handbill with a smudged charcoal drawing of a woman with wild hair. The words were stark and brutal. A $50 bounty for the capture, dead or alive, of the woman known as Clara, wanted for the attempted murder of Samuel Collins. Eli felt a cold rage settle in his gut. $50, the price of a good horse. That was what they thought her life was worth. He stood there for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he calmly reached out, pulled the notice from the wall, crumpled it into a tight ball, and dropped it into the blacksmith's forge as he walked past. He watched the paper blacken, curl, and turn to ash, the words of condemnation consumed by the flames. He bought his supplies and rode home, the weight of the secret heavier than ever. The bounty hunters came 3 days later. They appeared on the ridge to the west just as dusk was settling, 2 riders silhouetted against the blood-red sky. They were not lawmen. They were vultures, drawn by the scent of money. Eli saw them from the barn. His heart hammered against his ribs, a cold, hard beat of dread. "Inside," he said to Clara, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now!" She saw the look on his face and didn't question him. Once inside the cabin, he went directly to the thick bearskin rug in front of the hearth. He threw it back, revealing a trap door he had built into the floor. It was a small, dark space, a root cellar just big enough for one person. "Get in," he said. "Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear, do you understand?" Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror. She nodded, her throat working. She lowered herself into the cramped, dark space, pulling her knees to her chest. He looked down at her one last time, his expression grim. "I will not let them take you." Then he closed the door, pulled the heavy rug back over it, and kicked a little dust around for good measure. He stoked the fire, sat down at the table with his coffee cup, and waited. The knock on the door was loud and impatient. Eli took a slow breath and opened it. 2 men stood on his porch. The one in the lead was tall and thin, with a weasel-like face and pale, shifting eyes. The other was broad and brutish, a cudgel of a man with a week's worth of stubble on his jaw. "Evenin'," Weasel-Face said, his lips pulling back in a poor imitation of a smile. Looking for a man named Morgan. You found him, Eli said, blocking the doorway with his body. Heard you keep to yourself out here, the man continued, his eyes scanning the inside of the cabin over Eli's shoulder. Don't see many folks. We're looking for someone. A woman. Maybe you seen her. Dark hair, kinda skinny. Answers to Clara. Eli leaned against the doorframe, affecting a look of weary indifference. Been a long time since I had a woman in this cabin. Can't help you. $50 bounty on her, the big man grunted. A man could do a lot with $50. A man could also get himself shot, sticking his nose where it is not wanted, Eli said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. He let his hand drift down to rest on the butt of his Colt. Weaselface held up his hands. Easy now, friend. Just asking a neighborly question. No need for trouble. His eyes, however, were still darting around, noting the single cot, but also the extra cup on the table, the scent of fresh-baked bread that still lingered in the air. His gaze sharpened with suspicion. You find who you are looking for. You let me know, Eli said, his voice a clear dismissal. Now get off my land. The men exchanged a look. They knew he was lying, and he knew they knew, but they also saw the cold certainty in his eyes, the absolute lack of fear. They were bounty hunters, not fools. A gunfight over a suspicion was not a profitable business. Weaselface gave a final, lingering look at the cabin, then shrugged. Have it your way. Morgan. They turned and walked back to their horses. Eli stood in the doorway and watched until they were just two small specks disappearing into the vast, dark prairie. Only then did he shut the door and bolt it. He leaned against it, his own heart pounding, the adrenaline leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He pulled back the rug and opened the trap door. Clara unfolded herself from the small space, trembling uncontrollably. She stared at him, her face a mask of fury and terror. They're gone, he said quietly. That was when she broke. It was not a quiet weeping this time, but a storm of rage and despair. You do not understand, she cried, her voice cracking. She paced the small cabin like a caged animal. You stand there, so calm, so honorable. You think you are protecting some poor, innocent girl. She stopped and faced him, her eyes blazing. But I am not innocent. You want to know the truth? When he put his hands on me, when he whispered those filthy, pious words in my ear, I did not just want to escape. I wanted to fight back. I wanted him dead. I stabbed him. And I am not sorry for it. I wish the knife had gone deeper. The confession hung in the air, raw and violent. She stood before him, breathing in ragged gasps, her whole body trembling with the force of her admission. She had finally shown him the ugliest, most rage-filled part of herself, the part the world had condemned her for. She watched him, expecting to see disgust, to see the honor in his eyes finally curdle into judgment. Eli listened to her, his own face unmoving, his expression giving nothing away. He let her rage wash over him, understanding that it was a shield, a fire she had built to keep the horror at bay. He did not see a monster. He saw a woman who had been pushed to the very edge of her soul and had found the strength to push back. He saw the same desperate, violent will to survive that he himself carried. He walked over to the hearth, picked up a log, and placed it on the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney. He turned back to her, his eyes quiet and clear. That does not make you less of a woman, he said, his voice soft, but with an unshakable certainty. His words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, her mouth slightly open, the fire in her eyes faltering, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving vulnerability. He had not condemned her. He had not judged her. He had validated the one thing she thought made her a monster. He had seen her rage, and he had not turned away. The fight went out of her, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to pull her under. She took a step toward him, then another. She stopped just before him, so close he could feel the tremors that racked her body. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. her expression one of utter desperation and a raw, aching need. Her voice, when she spoke, was a ragged whisper, a plea torn from the deepest part of her. "Take me like a woman, then—" It was not a seduction. It was a challenge, a desperate cry to be seen not as a victim, not as a sinner, not as an innocent, but as a woman, in all her broken, furious, and wanting complexity. It was a plea to be held, to be touched in a way that would erase the memory of all the other touches, to be wanted for who she was, not in spite of it. Eli stood as still as a mountain, the turmoil inside him a silent, raging storm. He wanted to, God help him, he wanted to reach for her, to pull her against him, and answer the desperate plea in her eyes. He wanted to feel the warmth of her, to lose himself in the scent of her hair, to prove to her that a man's touch could be a comfort, not a wound. But he saw the raw desperation in her eyes, the plea born of fear and a terrifying gratitude. This was not the way. To take her now, in her moment of utter vulnerability, would be just another form of theft. It would be an act born of desperation, not love, and she deserved more than that. He deserved more than that. With a strength he did not know he possessed, he held her gaze for one long, agonizing moment. Then he turned and walked out the door, out into the vast, cold darkness of the night, leaving her alone with her plea hanging in the fire-lit air. He needed the cold, clean emptiness of the prairie to fight the storm she had unleashed inside him. For now, he would refuse. For now, he would protect her, even from himself. The night he walked away from her was the longest of Eli Morgan's life. He didn't go far, just to the edge of the cottonwoods that lined the creek bed, where the wind was a cold, clean razor against his skin. He stood there for hours, the vast, star-dusted emptiness of the prairie a mirror to the hollow ache inside him. Her whispered plea, "Take me like a woman, then," echoed in his mind, not as a temptation, but as a testament to her profound brokenness. To have taken what she offered in that moment would have made him no better than the men she was running from. But to deny the wanting in his own soul was a different kind of agony. He was caught in a current far stronger than he'd ever known. Desire was a part of it, a simple, primal pull toward her that he fought daily. But it was tangled up with something more dangerous, a deep, fierce, and terrifying need to protect her. It was the same instinct that had failed him with Jacob. The fear of repeating that failure was a ghost that walked beside him, whispering that anyone he chose to stand with was doomed to pay the price. He was a lightning rod for violence. To love someone, he thought, was to mark them for death. The next morning, a heavy silence hung between them. He could not meet her eyes, and she did not look at his. There was a new shame in the air, the shame of a gift offered and refused. He felt like a brute, and he could see in the slump of her shoulders that she felt rejected, her final, desperate gamble lost. He knew he couldn't navigate this alone. There was only one person he ever spoke to about the matters of his soul. After 3 days of this suffocating quiet, he rode east, toward the broken lands where the prairie gave way to jagged hills. Tomas lived in a small dugout carved into the side of a bluff, a place so seamlessly part of the land that a man could ride past it a dozen times and never see it. He was a small, wiry man in his 60s, his face a web of deep lines, his dark eyes holding the patient wisdom of the rocks and the sky. He was half Apache, a retired Army scout who had seen more bloodshed than any 10 men and had chosen to spend his remaining years in the company of eagles and silence. He was sitting by a small, smokeless fire, braiding a leather rope, and he looked up as Eli dismounted as if he had been expecting him all morning. "You look like a man who has swallowed a wasp," Tomas said without preamble, his voice a low rasp. He gestured with his chin toward a pot on the fire. "Coffee." Eli poured a cup and sat on a smooth stone opposite the old scout. He didn't know how to begin. He had never spoken of a woman to Thomas, had never spoken of his feelings to any man. "There is a woman at my cabin," Eli said finally, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. Tomas grunted, his fingers never ceasing their intricate work. A woman is not a coyote you can just leave scraps for and hope it moves on. She has a name, Clara, and she carries trouble, Tomas stated. It was not a question. Eli told him everything. He spoke of the dust storm, the preacher's son, the bounty hunters, Clara's rage, and her desperate plea. He spoke of the fear and the wanting that were tearing him apart. Tomas listened without interruption, his eyes on his work, his face impassive. When Eli finished, the silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. You are a fool. Eli Morgan, Tomas said at last, looking up, his dark eyes pinning Eli to his spot. You think this is a choice between your honor and your desire. It is not. The choice was made when you lifted her onto your horse. You chose her life over your peace. There is no going back. I do not want to see her hurt, Eli said, his voice raw. I feel like I am leading her into the same fire that took my brother. Tomas set down his braid and leaned forward, his expression hardening. Your brother died because of greed for land, because of Henderson's pride. This is different. This trouble is for a life, a woman's life. Do not dishonor her by comparing her to a range war. She is not a piece of territory to be won or lost. He paused, his gaze softening slightly. You want to protect her, but you are afraid of what it will cost you. You are right to be afraid. Love in this country, the real kind, is not a gentle thing. It is a fight, and it always comes with blood. Eli rode back to the ranch with Tomas's words echoing in his mind. The choice was made. It was true. He had been pretending he could control the situation, that he could keep her safe within the fences of his land and his own rigid rules. But the world was coming for her, and he had to decide if he was going to stand with her or stand aside. When he arrived, he found that Clara had been making her own choices, while he had been grappling with his soul. She had been preparing for war. He found her behind the barn, a space cleared, her small knife in her hand. She was practicing, her movements no longer hesitant but fluid and deadly. She threw the knife again and again at a crude target drawn on a piece of cottonwood bark, the blade striking with a solid thwack each time, closer and closer to the center. Her face was set in a mask of intense concentration. She was not the frightened creature he had found by the creek bed. She was a woman honing her only weapon. She saw him watching and stopped, a faint flush on her cheeks. She had expected him to disapprove, to see her violence as another stain on her character, but he just nodded, a flicker of grim approval in his eyes. Keep your wrist straight, was all he said before walking away. From that day on, her training became part of their routine. She practiced with the knife, and he coached her with the pistol, her aim improving with every box of cartridges he could spare. She was preparing to run again. He could see it in the way she looked toward the horizon, the way she kept her few belongings bundled in a cloth. But something else was happening, too. A quiet, tentative courtship was unfolding in the spaces between their guarded words. He would come in from the forge, and a cup of water would be on the table, a single, bright blue wildflower floating in it. He would find his spare neckerchief, which he had thought lost, washed and neatly folded on his pillow. One morning, he found the worn leather cover of his mother's poetry book had been carefully mended, the stitches small and precise. These were small, silent offerings, gestures of a tenderness she did not dare speak aloud. Each one was a small crack in the wall he had built around his heart. He never acknowledged them, but he saw every single one. The piece, fragile as it was not meant to last. A new group of riders appeared in the valley a week later. There were 5 of them, and they moved with the self-assured swagger of men who believed God was on their side. They were not bounty hunters. They were vigilantes. They rode into redemption and declared their purpose in the saloon for all to hear. They were a holy posse. come to hunt down the seductress, the Jezebel who had tried to murder a man of God's own family. Their leader was a man with a hard, unforgiving face and eyes that burned with righteous fury. His name was Thomas Collins, and he was the preacher's brother. News of their arrival traveled on the wind, reaching Eli's ranch through a friendly neighbor who rode out to warn him. When Eli told Clara, the last vestiges of color drained from her face. This was worse than bounty hunters. These men were not after money. They were after a hanging. They wanted to make an example of her. "I have to leave," she said that night, her voice flat and decided. "They want me, Eli, not you. If I am gone, they will have no reason to trouble you further. You have done more for me than I deserve. I will not be the cause of your ruin." "No," he said, his voice a low command. He stood up from the table and faced her. The time for indecision was over. "You are not going anywhere alone." "You cannot stop me," she challenged, her chin rising. "I can," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "And I will. This is my land. This is my fight now, too." The next day, the vigilantes came. Eli saw them coming from a long way off. 5 riders kicking up a plume of dust as they headed directly for his watering hole, the only reliable source of water in that part of the valley. He knew they were coming to force a confrontation. He strapped on his gun belt. "Stay in the cabin," he ordered Clara. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She had his spare Colt tucked into the waistband of her pants, and her own knife was strapped to her forearm, hidden beneath the sleeve of his old shirt. "I will not hide while you face them for me. I will stand with you." He looked at her, at the terror and the resolve warring in her eyes, and he knew he could not change her mind. He gave a curt nod. Together, they walked out of the cabin and down the slight slope toward the creek, the sun hot on their backs. Thomas Collins and his men were waiting, their horses drinking from the trough. Collins was a bigger man than his brother. The preacher, with a thick neck and a cruel twist to his mouth. He dismounted as Eli and Clara approached. "Morgan," Collins said, his voice dripping with contempt. "We came for the harlot. We know she's here. Hand her over and we'll leave you in peace." "The only one I see here disturbing the peace is you, Collins," Eli said, his voice dangerously calm. He came to a stop 20 feet from them, Clara a step behind him. "This is private property. Get off it." Collins laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This woman is a fugitive, a sinner who attacked my blood. God's law is higher than any property line. Give her to us, or we will have to take her." Clara stepped forward. "This is not his fight," she said, her voice high and strained. "I will go with you. Just leave him be." "Clara, no!" Eli growled, putting a hand on her arm to pull her back. "Too late for that." "Morgan," Collins sneered, his eyes glittering. He gestured with his head toward the barn, which stood on a low rise behind the cabin. "That's a fine-looking barn you got there. Solid oak. Looks like tinders up real nice in a fire. You give us the woman, or we'll burn you out. We'll salt the earth you stand on." Eli looked at his barn. He had built it with his father and Jacob. Inside was the old family saddle, his mother's rocking chair, a chest of his father's tools. It was all he had left of them. It was his history, his legacy, and this man was threatening to turn it to ash. "She's not going anywhere," Eli said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Seeing his resolve, Clara panicked. She tried to wrench her arm from his grip, to surrender herself, to save him from the choice she was forcing him to make. "Let me go," she cried. "It's my fault." Collins and his men laughed. One of them, a lanky youth with a mean streak, took a step forward. "Listen to the lady, Morgan. She knows her place." That was when something inside Eli snapped. All the rage, all the grief for his brother, all the fierce, protective love he felt for the woman beside him, exploded in a single, silent act of violence. He released Clara's arm, took one long stride forward, and drove his fist into the lanky youth's face. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage, and the man went down like a sack of grain, spitting blood and teeth into the dust. The world erupted into chaos. Collins roared in fury, his hand dropping to his gun. The other men scrambled for their own weapons. Eli drew his Colt, the motion a blur, and fired. Not at a man, but at the ground in front of Collins' horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing Collins off balance. A gun went off beside Eli's ear, the sound deafening. Clara was standing beside him, her face pale, the pistol held in a two-handed grip, firing toward the vigilantes. They were in it together now, side by side, a desperate two-person army against a wave of righteous hate. Eli shoved her behind the stone wall of the trough, pushing her down as a bullet whizzed past his head. Chipping a shard of rock from the wall, he fired back, aiming for cover, trying to drive them back rather than kill them. But these men were not bounty hunters. They were fanatics. They would not be scared off. One of the men had circled around behind a cluster of boulders. Eli saw the glint of the sun on his rifle barrel just as he was reloading. The man was taking careful aim. A clean shot right at Eli's exposed back. There was no time to turn, no time to take cover. He was dead. Eli! Clara screamed his name. In that split second, as the rifleman squeezed his trigger, she rose from behind the trough. She was not holding the pistol. In her hand was her knife, with a movement so swift and fluid it was almost invisible. She threw it. The blade flew through the air, a silver streak, and buried itself to the hilt in the rifleman's chest. His eyes went wide with shock. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. The rifle discharged, the bullet going harmlessly into the sky. He gave a soft grunt, looked down at the knife handle protruding from his shirt, and then collapsed behind the rocks. The sudden, shocking death of their companion broke the vigilante's nerve. Collins, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, fired one last wild shot before he and the others scrambled for their horses, scooped up their fallen, groaning friend, and fled back the way they had come. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the nervous whinny of a horse and the sound of their own ragged breathing. Clara stared at the rocks where the man had fallen, her hand still outstretched, her face a blank canvas of shock. She had just killed a man. She had killed to save him. Eli grabbed her arm. "We have to go. They'll be back." They ran back to the cabin, their hearts pounding. They barricaded the door and took up positions at the windows, waiting. But the vigilantes did not return. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. The immediate danger seemed to have passed. They had won. They had survived. The victory was short-lived. As darkness fell, a flicker of light appeared on the rise near the barn. At first it was small, a single, malevolent orange eye in the gloom. Then it grew, swelling and brightening, licking its way up the dry timber walls. They had circled back. They had not come for a fight. They had come to keep their promise. Eli and Clara could only watch in horrified silence from the cabin window as the barn was consumed by flames. The fire roared, a hungry beast devouring his past, turning his memories to smoke and ash. The roof sagged, then collapsed inward with a great shower of sparks that flew up into the night sky like a host of angry stars. His mother's chair, his father's tools, the saddle he and Jacob had shared, all of it was gone. He had saved the woman, but he had lost everything else. He stood there, the fierce, hot light of the blaze reflecting in his eyes, and he felt Clara's hand slide into his, her small, trembling fingers lacing through his own. The price had been paid, blood had been spilled, and his world had been burned to the ground. They stood before the smoldering corpse of the barn as if at a graveside. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind a blackened skeleton of timbers that clawed at the dawn sky. The air, thick with the acrid smell of wet ash and charred memories, was a shroud over the valley. Eli stared at the ruin, his face a mask of stone, but Clara could feel the tremors in the hand that still held hers. She saw not just a burned building, but the funeral pyre of his entire history. His father's tools, his mother's chair, the last tangible pieces of the boy named Jacob. All of it had been offered up as a sacrifice to the God of her safety. The guilt was a physical thing, a sickness that rose from her stomach and tightened its grip on her throat. Every kindness he had shown her, every quiet moment of peace she had found in this small sanctuary, had been paid for with this devastation. She was a blight, a walking pestilence, and she had brought her plague to the one good man she had ever known. She had watched him build his world out of honor and solitude, and she had brought the match that burned it to the ground. They did not speak for the rest of the day. The silence was a chasm between them, filled with the ghosts of what he had lost and the weight of what she had done. He worked with a grim, mechanical fury, pulling salvageable tools from the wreckage, his movements stiff with a grief he would not voice. She cooked and cleaned inside the cabin, her hands trembling, every small domestic act feeling like a profound hypocrisy. How could she offer him comfort in a home she had all but destroyed? That night, she lay on her bedroll, listening to the sound of his breathing across the dark room. It was a slow, steady rhythm, but she knew he was not asleep. He was lying there staring into the darkness, and she was the source of it. She had repaid his protection with ruin. There was only one currency she had left to offer, one final act of penance. She had to remove herself. She had to give him back his life by disappearing from it. She waited until the moon was high and the cabin was steeped in the deep silence of the dead of night. She rose from her bedroll, her movements as quiet as a moth's wing. She dressed in the dark, her fingers fumbling with the buttons on his old shirt. She had nothing to pack, nothing that was truly hers except the knife strapped to her arm and the clothes on her back. She looked at his sleeping form, a dark shape under a blanket on the cot. A terrible ache bloomed in her chest, a longing to go to him, to touch his face, to say the words she did not know how to say. But to stay was to bring more destruction. She was a debt he could never stop paying. To leave was the only kindness she had left to give. She slipped the bolt on the door, its well-oiled slide making almost no sound. The night air was cold and clean on her face. She took one step onto the porch, then another, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She would walk east, toward the rising sun, and she would not look back. "And where do you think you are going?" His voice came out of the darkness behind her, low and rough, and it stopped her as surely as a physical blow. She froze, her back to him. He had not been asleep. He had been waiting. He stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. He was just a tall shadow in the moonlight, but she could feel the force of his gaze on her back. "I am leaving," she said, her own voice a thin whisper. "They will not trouble you anymore if I am gone." "You think that is what this is about?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "My barn, my trouble." "I have brought you nothing but ruin," she choked out, the words tasting like ash. "I cannot stay here and watch you lose everything else because of me." He was silent for a long moment. She could hear the wind sighing in the pines, the distant cry of a coyote. She kept her back to him, unable to face the condemnation she was sure she would see in his eyes. "Turn around, Clara," he said. It was not a request. Slowly, she turned. His face was in shadow, but she could see the glint of the moonlight in his eyes. He took a step closer, and then another, until he was standing right in front of her. So close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Every day since you have been here," he began, his voice a low rumble, "I have watched you. I have watched you gentle a horse that would not let another soul near it. I have watched you mend my clothes with stitches so fine I can barely see them. I have seen you stand your ground with a gun in your hand. And I have seen you kill a man to save my life." He paused, his gaze intense. "And I have seen you try to run in the middle of the night, with nothing but the clothes I gave you, Because you think your own life is worth less than a building full of old wood and ghosts." He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently touch a lock of her hair that had fallen across her face. "So, I will ask you a question," he said, his voice dropping even lower, filled with a raw and aching tenderness she had never heard from anyone. "Why do you think your body is all you have to offer?" The question undid her. It was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had ever been taught, everything she believed about herself. Men had only ever wanted one thing from her. Samuel had wanted her submission. The town had wanted her shame. Even her own father, in his own well-meaning way, had seen her as a commodity to be traded for a respectable marriage. She had tried to offer Eli her body once, in a desperate plea, and he had refused. Now she was trying to offer him her absence. Another transaction, and he was refusing that as well. He was not asking for a price. He was asking for her soul. A sob tore from her throat, a ragged, ugly sound, the dam of her control, which she had held together through abuse and fear and violence, finally broke, and the whole story, the entire ugly, sordid truth, came pouring out. "Because it is all they ever wanted," she wept, the words tumbling over one another in a frantic, desperate rush. "My father, he did not mean to be cruel, but he saw a daughter who was too quiet, too plain. He arranged the marriage to Samuel Collins. A good family, he said, a preacher's son. I would be safe, respected." She was shaking now, the memories washing over her. "But Samuel, he did not want a wife. He wanted a possession. He said I was full of worldly pride, that he would have to break me of it before God. He quoted scripture while his hands were rough. He said it was his duty to tame me." She looked up at Eli, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "On the night before the wedding, he took me to a room in the back of the house. He said he wanted to pray with me. He locked the door. He told me that our union would begin then, that he would cleanse me of my sin right there. He said it was for my own good, that I should be grateful." The horror of it was fresh, as if it were happening all over again. "I told him no. I fought. He got angry. He said I was a temptress, that my defiance was a sin, and he would beat it out of me if he had to. He pushed me down, and I saw the knife. It was on a table, beside a Bible. I do not even remember picking it up. I just remember the look on his face when he saw it in my hand. He laughed, and then he lunged at me." Her breath hitched, and the final words came out as a barely audible whisper. "I stabbed him to escape. I ran until my feet were raw and my lungs burned. And his family, the town, they called me a harlot, a killer. They said I led him on, that I deserved whatever he had planned for me." She finally collapsed, her strength gone. She sagged against him, her face buried in his chest, her hands clutching his shirt. The full weight of her shame and despair poured out of her in a torrent of tears. "You cannot save me, Cowboy," she whispered into the rough fabric of his shirt, her voice muffled and broken. "I am already ruined." Eli stood there, a pillar of strength in the face of her storm. He did not flinch from her story. He did not recoil from her pain. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her trembling body against his hand stroking her hair. He had wanted to know what ghosts haunted her, and now he did. They were uglier and more monstrous than anything he could have imagined, but they were not her. They were the ghosts of other people's sins. He let her cry until her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He held her, simply held her, offering the silent comfort of his presence. When she was quiet, he put a calloused finger under her chin and gently tilted her face up to his. In the pale moonlight, he could see the tear tracks on her cheeks, the raw anguish in her eyes. "Then let me be ruined with you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name. It was not a promise of salvation. It was a pledge of solidarity. He was not a savior on a white horse. He was a man with his own ruins, his own ghosts. He was offering to stand with her in the ashes, to share the burden of her past as if it were his own. He was choosing her, all of her, not just the survivor but the killer, not just the victim but the woman full of rage. He was choosing her ruin. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound and desperate tenderness. It was a question, a comfort, a prayer. Her lips were soft and trembling under his. For a moment, she was still shocked, and then she responded, a small, hesitant movement that was a surrender and an acceptance all at once. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her back inside the cabin. He did not take her to her bedroll on the floor. He carried her to his own cot and gently laid her down. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, warm light over the small room. In that quiet, fire-lit moment, they came together. It was nothing like the desperate plea she had made before. It was slow, hesitant, a sacred exploration of two broken souls seeking solace. His touch was a reverence, a gentle undoing of all the brutal touches that had come before. He mapped the landscape of her scars with his hands and his lips, not to erase them, but to know them, to accept them as part of her. And she, in turn, discovered the deep well of tenderness hidden beneath his stoic exterior. It was a desperate, gentle, and profoundly human act, a silent vow that from this moment on, they would no longer be alone in their brokenness. She woke to the smell of coffee and the unfamiliar warmth of the morning sun on her face. For a single, blissful moment, she did not know where she was. Then it all came back. The fire, the confession, the breathtaking tenderness of the night. She was in Eli's bed. She was wearing his shirt. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she did not feel afraid. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her. Eli was standing by the fire, his back to her, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He was already dressed, his shoulders broad and steady in the morning light. He turned, and his eyes met hers. There was no awkwardness, no regret in his gaze. There was only a quiet, steady calm. He brought a cup to her, his calloused fingers brushing hers as she took it. She drank the hot, black coffee, the warmth spreading through her. It felt different this morning. The cabin, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a home. "We are going to town," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. She looked at him, startled. "To town? Eli, they will arrest me. They will hang me." "They can try," he said, his voice flat. He looked at her, his expression serious. "We are done running. Clara, we are done hiding. We will go in together, and we will tell them the truth. All of it." She stared at him, her heart pounding. The thought was terrifying. To face the town, to face the sheriff, to face the whispers and the judgment, it seemed impossible. But then she looked at his face, at the quiet determination in his eyes. He was not asking her to face it alone. He was saying, "We." A slow, tentative smile spread across her face. It was a small thing, but it transformed her, chasing the shadows from her eyes. It was the first real smile she had offered since the day he found her. It was the smile of a woman who had finally found something, and someone, worth fighting for. "All right, Cowboy," she said softly. "We will face them together." They rode into redemption not like fugitives, but like a man and a woman with a purpose. He had insisted she ride the gentle mare, while he rode Dust beside her. At the edge of town, he reached over and took her hand. They rode down the center of the main street arm in arm, a silent, defiant couple. Heads turned. The townspeople stopped and stared. Whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. She could feel the heat of their glares, the weight of their judgment. She saw Mrs. Gable from the general store, her mouth a thin line of disapproval. She saw men in front of the saloon stop their conversations to gawk, their eyes lingering on her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. She wanted to shrink, to look away, But she felt the steady pressure of Eli's hand, and she forced herself to keep her head high, her gaze straight ahead. Then she noticed something else. Not everyone was glaring. A few faces held a different expression, a flicker of sympathy in the eyes of the blacksmith's wife, a look of weary understanding from an old woman sweeping her porch. A few people, mostly women, did not look at her with condemnation, but with a guarded, knowing sorrow. Their destination was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a big man, run to fat, with a drooping mustache and tired eyes. He looked up from his paperwork as they entered, his expression souring when he saw who it was. "Morgan," he grunted. "I heard you had some trouble out at your place, and I see you found the source of it." His eyes dismissed Clara as if she were a piece of troublesome livestock. "I have a warrant for this woman, for attempted murder. She acted in self-defense." "Brody," Eli said, his voice calm and steady. He did not let go of Clara's hand. "Self-defense?" the sheriff scoffed. "She stabbed the preacher's son, a boy who was trying to save her soul. He locked her in a room." "Sheriff," Eli said, his voice hardening. "He meant to do her harm. She fought back to save her own life. That is not a crime. That is survival." Just then, the door to the office opened. Thomas Collins, the preacher's brother, stood there, his face dark with rage. "There she is, the murderess! Sheriff, are you going to arrest this foul sinner, or do I have to see to justice myself?" "Now, hold on. Thomas," the sheriff said, rising from his chair. The situation was escalating, the small office suddenly thick with tension. "She is a liar and a harlot!" Collins roared, pointing a trembling finger at Clara. "She seduced my nephew and then tried to kill him when he resisted her wicked advances." Clara flinched, but before Eli could speak, another voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. "That is not true." Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway were three women. One was Martha Miller, the wife of the general store owner. With her were two other women from the church choir, their faces grim and determined. "Mrs." Miller stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her, but her eyes were not timid. "We all know Samuel Collins," she said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying in the sudden silence. "We have seen the way he looks at young women. We have heard the things he says when he thinks no one of note is listening. He is not the saint his father pretends he is." "This is slander," Collins bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. "Is it?" another of the women asked, her voice trembling slightly but holding steady. "My own daughter told me he cornered her after a service, said things, unseemly things. We told her to stay away from him. We all did. We all warned our daughters." The sheriff looked from the women to Collins, a flicker of uncertainty in his tired eyes. The town's solid wall of condemnation was cracking. This was no longer a simple matter of a sinner and a saint. It was becoming something far more complicated. The tension in the small office was a palpable thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. The word of three church-going, respectable women against the brother of the preacher. Eli and Clara stood their ground, their hands still clasped together, a silent island in the center of the storm. Sheriff Brody sighed, rubbing a hand over his weary face. He was a lawman, not a judge. He could see this was not a matter that would be settled with a loud voice or a fast gun. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "There will be a trial. We'll let the circuit judge sort this out when he gets here. The trial is set for 3 days from now." He looked at Clara, then at Eli's unyielding face. "Until then, she's your responsibility. Morgan, you keep her out of trouble." He knew putting her in his jail cell with Collins' friends in town would be a death sentence. Eli nodded once. He turned, and with Clara's hand still firmly in his, he led her out of the sheriff's office and back into the unforgiving sunlight of the main street. They had not won their freedom, but they had won a chance. They had faced the town, and they were still standing. Together. The 3 days before the trial were a strange and suspended time. a breath held before a plunge into icy water. The air on the ranch was thick with unspoken possibilities, both of salvation and of the gallows. Eli moved with a grim, relentless purpose, a man whittling down a mountain of trouble with the small knife of his will. He was no longer just a rancher. He was an advocate, a detective, a guardian. His first ride was not to town, but east, back to the broken lands. He found Tomas sitting in his usual spot, watching the hawks ride the updrafts. The old scout already knew. News traveled through that country on currents unseen, carried by wind and whispers. "The town will want blood," Tomas said, his voice flat. "It is easier to sacrifice a woman than to question a preacher." "I need you to speak for her," Eli said, "to tell them what you see. You look at people and you do not see what they pretend to be. You see what they are." Tomas looked out at the vast expanse of the prairie. His eyes narrowed. "I will tell them that I see a woman who was hunted and who learned the ways of the hunter to stay alive. I will tell them I see a woman with more courage in her heart than all of Collins's men put together. They will not like my words. They will call me a heathen savage." He turned his gaze back to Eli, and a rare, thin smile touched his lips. "I will enjoy that." Eli's next visit was to Redemption, to the small clapboard house of Dr. Abernathy. The doctor was an old man. His hands gnarled with arthritis and his shoulders stooped from a lifetime of bending over the sick and the dying. He was a man who preferred to remain invisible, a quiet, cleaner-upper of the town's violent messes. Eli found him in his office, the air thick with the cloying scent of carbolic acid and dried herbs. "I cannot get involved, Eli," the doctor said before Eli had even fully stated his purpose. He was washing his hands in a basin, his back to the room. "The Collins family, they have long memories. The church board oversees my stipend." "You are a man of medicine, Doctor," Eli said, his voice low and even. "You are supposed to tend to the truth of a body, not the politics of a town." "The truth is a luxury I cannot always afford," Abernathy murmured, his hands still moving in the water. "A few weeks before I found her," Eli pressed on, his voice hardening slightly. "A young woman came to you, dark hair, quiet. She had bruises on her arms and a cut on her lip. She told you she had fallen down the stairs at the preacher's house." "Doctor," Abernathy stopped washing his hands. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, his back rigid. "Patient records are a private matter." "Those bruises," Eli said, stepping closer. "Were they from a fall down the stairs?" The doctor slowly reached for a towel, his movements weary. He turned, his old eyes full of a deep, profound sadness. "No, son," he said quietly. "They were not from a fall. They were the shape of a man's fingers, where he had gripped her, and the cut on her lip was from a blow. I have seen the same marks on a dozen other women in this town who claim to be clumsy. I gave her a salve and told her to be more careful. It is all I ever do." "This time, you can do more," Eli said. "You can tell the truth." While Eli moved through the world of men, gathering the sparse weapons of truth, Clara fought a different battle within the four walls of the cabin. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a defendant. She spent the hours pacing, replaying every moment of her ordeal, her mind a courtroom where she was both witness and accused. The fear was a constant, cold companion, but beneath it, a new and unfamiliar feeling was taking root, a fragile shoot of resolve. She would not let Eli's faith in her be in vain. On the second day, a visitor came. It was Martha Miller, the general store owner's wife, the woman who had spoken for her at the sheriff's office. She arrived in a small buckboard, her face etched with worry. Eli was out, checking the fence line. Mrs. Miller refused to come inside, standing on the porch and twisting a handkerchief in her hands. "Child," she said, her voice a nervous whisper, "you do not have to do this. There are good people in this town, but there are more who are afraid. The preacher holds a lot of sway. They will not give you a fair hearing." She pressed a small, heavy purse into Clara's hand. "There is enough here for a stagecoach ticket, and more besides. My husband's cousin has a freight business that runs west at dawn tomorrow. He can take you. No one will know. You can disappear. Start a new life where no one knows your name." Clara looked at the purse in her hand. It was an offering of escape, a key to a door she had been desperately seeking since the day she fled the preacher's house. Freedom. It was everything she had ever wanted. She could take it and run. She could leave this all behind, the trial, the whispers, the glares. She could spare Eli any more trouble. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. She looked past Mrs. Miller toward the blackened ruin of the barn. She thought of Eli's quiet, unwavering belief in her, of his pledge to be ruined with her. To run now would be to prove all his faith was misplaced. It would be an admission of the guilt the town was so eager to place upon her. To run was to let Samuel Collins win, to let him and his kind define her forever as a ruined, guilty thing. She closed her fingers around the purse and then gently, firmly, pressed it back into Mrs. Miller's hand. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice clear and steady. "You are a kind woman, but my new life starts here. It starts when I stand up and tell the truth. I am done with running." The trial was held in the saloon. The long bar was draped with a dusty canvas sheet, and a dozen chairs were arranged in 2 rows for the jury, a grim-faced collection of local ranchers and merchants who looked deeply uncomfortable in their Sunday best. The room was packed, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale beer, and nervous sweat. Eli and Clara sat at a small table near the front. Eli's face was a stoic mask, but his hand rested on Clara's, a silent, steady anchor in the churning sea of hostile faces. The circuit judge was a lean, hawk-nosed man named Fairfield, who looked upon the proceedings with an air of profound boredom, as if he had seen this same shabby drama play out in 100 other dusty towns. Thomas Collins spoke for the prosecution. He did not present evidence. He delivered a sermon. He paced before the jury, his Bible in his hand, his voice a booming instrument of righteousness. He spoke of the serpent in the garden, of the wickedness of Eve, of the inherent frailty and sinfulness of the female sex. He did not call Clara by her name. He called her the woman, the accused, the vessel of temptation. "This woman!" he thundered, his arm outstretched, his finger pointing directly at Clara, "is a Jezebel, sent by the devil himself to test the virtue of good men. She worked her feminine wiles on my poor, God-fearing nephew, a boy who sought only to guide her back to the path of righteousness. And when he spurned her wicked advances, she struck at him like a viper, attempting to murder him in the very house of God's own servant." He worked the crowd into a fervor, his words painting a picture of a saintly boy and a demonic seductress. Clara sat still, her head held high, though she felt the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her, branding her with their judgment. When Collins finally finished, spent and sweating, the judge turned his tired eyes to Eli. "Mr. Morgan, does the defense have a response?" Eli rose slowly to his feet. He did not look at the jury. He did not look at the judge. He looked at Thomas Collins. He stood in silence for a long moment, letting the echoes of the preacher's brother's rage dissipate in the quiet of the room. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense atmosphere with the clean, sharp edge of cold steel. "I am not a lawyer," he began, "and I do not know much about the serpent in the garden, but I know about locked doors, and I know about bruises." He turned his gaze to the jury. "Mr. Collins has told you a story. It is a loud story, and it is full of fire. But it is just a story. He has brought no witnesses who saw this supposed seduction. He has brought no proof of her wicked advances. He has brought you nothing but the word of an angry man trying to protect his family's name." He took a step forward. Doctor, Abernathy has told you that he treated Clara for injuries consistent with a beating, days before the incident took place. Thomas, who has lived in these lands longer than any of us, has told you that he saw a woman fighting for her life, not a woman looking for trouble. A locked door is not a parlor for prayer. Gentlemen, it is a cage, and a man who strikes a woman is not a saint. He is a coward. He paused, his quiet words holding more power than all of Collins's bluster. The only thing this woman is guilty of is refusing to be a victim. She is guilty of believing her life was worth fighting for. If that is a crime in this town, then you should hang us both. He sat down. The silence in the room was absolute. Miss Clara, the judge said, his voice softer than before. Do you wish to speak on your own behalf? Clara looked at Eli. He gave her hand a slight, encouraging squeeze. She stood and walked to the front of the room, her step steady, her worn dress a stark contrast to the finery of the preacher's wife, who sat in the front row glaring at her. Clara did not look at her accusers. She looked at the 12 men on the jury, at their weathered faces and their calloused hands. She looked at them as equals. My name is Clara, she said, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength with every word. Not the woman, not the sinner. Clara. She told them her story. She spoke of the arranged marriage, of Samuel's piety that felt like a trap, of his words that were meant to diminish her, to make her small. She spoke of the locked door, of the fear, of the certainty that she was about to be terribly hurt. He told me I was wicked, she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced every whisper in the room. He said it was his duty to break me. He treated me like an object, a thing he owned, a piece of property to be tamed and used for his own purposes. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the women, of Martha Miller, of the doctor's wife, of others, and she saw her own story reflected in their guarded expressions. I am not an object, she said, her voice rising, filled with all the pain and rage and defiance she had held inside for so long. I am a woman, and I fought back. She stood there for a moment longer, her truth laid bare for all to see. Then she turned and walked back to her seat beside Eli. The jury filed out. The room buzzed with tense, excited chatter. Clara and Eli sat in silence, their hands clasped on the table between them. They had done all they could do. They waited. An hour passed, feeling like a lifetime. Finally, the jury returned, their faces grim and unreadable. They took their seats. The foreman, an old rancher with pale blue eyes, stood up, a piece of paper in his trembling hand. He cleared his throat. On the charge of attempted murder, he read, his voice raspy. We, the jury, find the defendant, Clara, not guilty. A collective gasp went through the room. For a moment, there was stunned silence. And then the saloon erupted. Thomas Collins roared in outrage, his face purple with fury. But a smattering of applause broke out from the back of the room. Led by Martha Miller and the other women, Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. She sagged in her chair, the tension of the past weeks draining out of her in a rush, leaving her weak and trembling. Eli's arm went around her, holding her steady. They had won. Later, as they were leaving, Sheriff Brody pulled Eli aside. You won this round, Morgan, he said, his voice low. But that was the town's sense of fairness talking, not its heart. The Collins family will not forget this. This valley is not big enough for all of you. You will not be welcome here much longer. Eli had known this. He looked over at Clara, who was accepting a quiet, tearful hug from Mrs. Miller. He looked at the hard, hateful stares of Collins's supporters. This place was no longer his home. It was just a piece of land, haunted by a burned-out barn and a legacy of blood. His future was standing right there, in a worn-out dress, her face shining with a fragile, new-found freedom. He sold the ranch for a fraction of what it was worth to a neighboring outfit. The paperwork signed on the back of a crate in Miller's general store. He kept only the horses, 2 rifles, and what few supplies would fit on a pack mule. On their final evening, they went to say goodbye to Thomas. The old scout looked them over, a long, appraising gaze. He nodded slowly, as if they had passed some unspoken test. He gave them a heavy sack of dried jerky and a waterskin larger than any Eli owned. "The land is wide," Thomas said, his hand resting on Eli's shoulder for a moment. "Find a piece of it that is quiet." He looked at Clara, and his weathered face softened. "Walk in sunshine, little warrior," he said. That night, for the last time, they stood on the porch of the cabin, looking out over the valley. A new moon hung in the sky, a silver sliver of promise. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of dust and distance. Clara leaned her head against Eli's shoulder. The silence between them was no longer a space of fear or uncertainty, but one of deep, abiding peace. "Do you still think I was innocent?" she whispered. The question not an accusation, but a genuine curiosity. A final testing of the foundation they had built. Eli looked down at her, at the strength in her profile, at the wisdom in her eyes that had been bought at such a terrible price. He thought of the terrified woman he had found in the storm, and the fierce woman who had stood with him in the fight. Innocence was a myth, a word for a world that did not exist. "No," he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble in his chest. "But I still love you." He felt her smile against his shoulder. At dawn, they mounted their horses, without a backward glance at the cabin, at the ruin of the barn, at the graves of his family. They rode away, 2 scarred souls heading west into the harsh, beautiful light of a new day, ready to build a future on a foundation of their own making. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the unforgiving yet beautiful frontier. And please let us know in the comments where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans of the West. Do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.